Oh shoot, when did I make that quilt? I think it was. How many quilt tops do you have stacked waiting for quilting? Do you remember the specifics about them, the date it was completed, the story behind them, all of that information? Here at Quilting Plus More, we're all about bringing your quilts to life so they can be treasured for generations. I bring this up because the stories or provenance of these quilts is important. Quilts are made for so many reasons. Some are for display and some utilitarian. The chances that these quilts outlive us is pretty good, and shouldn't their story live on with the quilt? Plus, their story, when known, could actually add monetary value. I am passionate about quilt stories and their makers. We create for so many reasons, but the provenance of quilts needs to be told, written, and documented, completely and accurately recorded on a quilt label, sewn on, so to accompany these quilts. Unfortunately, quilts get lost and stolen, and the quilt label attached to a quilt could help it find its way back home. Last, artists sign their work, and so should you. This quilt top was pieced in time of crisis, and then I put it away. I wrote my label at the time I pieced this top. If this quilt did not have this label tucked inside, the depth of emotion and specifics of that time would have been lost. I encourage you to label your quilts for future generations to know the story. At minimum, write the label out on paper. Tuck it inside the quilt top. That paper label can be transferred to fabric later on. So, do you label your quilts? If your answer is no or sometimes, do and always. We now know how important it is to label quilts. So what do we put on the label? The minimum is the maker's name, the date they completed it, and the location where it was made. Some information that could be included is the piecer's name, the quilter's name, their city, state, and maybe even their country. If the piecer and the quilter are the same, I just say pieced and quilted by. The recipient's name, their city, state, and maybe even their country or specific address. The date that it's completed, and here you could be as specific as you want. You could include the full date, you could include the month and the year, or just the year. You could even add the date that it was started as well as the date completed. The name of the quilt, or maybe the pattern name that was used and information about the pattern. How about some sentiments or a personalized message, or maybe even scripture, pictures? You could include quilt care instructions, or you could also include a list of the awards that the quilt has won. If you quilt by check, recognize them. So now, how do you make one? Holy smokes, there are so many ways. Whatever your imagination could cook up goes. As always, there are pros and cons to everything, so I'll try to touch on some of them as I go through. Embroidery by hand or sewing machine is a great look. It's a wonderful personal touch, whether it's done by hand or machine to create your label. Fabric pins are a fast, easy way to create a label. Using a pin specific to fabric, like the Pigma Micron pin, is a safe bet to write on a fabric label or even the back of a quilt. Make sure to heat set the ink and use a fabric pin that is archival quality, acid-free, and won't bleed. Some use permanent markers as well. Whatever pen or marker you decide to use, test it if it's the first time using that type. Pre-printed labels is another method you could use. Pre-printed labels either come by the yard, or you could even print out your own and fill in the information. I feel more comfortable ironing freezer paper on the back of a pre-printed label so that when I'm writing, that fabric is stable. And this is especially useful when the fabric is more silky. Inkjet printer labels is another option. You literally just print your label out on fabric. You can buy stabilized fabric sheets, or you can make your own. You can also buy custom labels. Etsy, oh my gosh, Etsy has a ton of options for custom labels. Like my machine does not have the functions and capability to do embroidery. Etsy has a ton of sites where you could buy a custom embroidery label. The only downside that I see to custom labels is the added cost and time. You could incorporate the label information right into the quilting. You could do it in a couple of ways. You could free motion quilt the information right in, or you could write it out with a removable pen, quilt over the markings, and then remove the pen. Another option is that you could use a walking foot and literally just stitch out block letters. Iron-on labels is another option, and literally it's just what it says. You iron on the pattern onto your fabric and you trace over it with a permanent marker so that the design is not lost, and then you fill in the label information. Another option, tag or ribbon labels. Tag or ribbon labels are small, with minimal information on them because they are small, and typically they're sewn into the binding. These are usually used by those that make and sell items because they are small and they don't really detract from the design. My favorite method to use is my inkjet printer and Word. You got it. I type out my label in a Word document and print it right out onto fabric. I know what a nice personal touch it is to have a handwritten label, but seriously, I was not graced with beautiful or even nice handwriting. I also like to frame my label with scrap pieces of fabric. Leave a comment below if you'd be interested in seeing a video of my method or any of the other methods that have been mentioned. So now that leaves, where should a label go? There really is no right or wrong answer here. Most common is a hand sewn on label on the back corner of the quilt after it has been quilted. To hand stitch the label down, I mostly use a blind hem stitch. You could also sew two sides of the label into the binding, then hand stitch the remaining side or sides down. Some use a square or a triangle for this method. The label could be fused or stitched down onto the backing of the quilt prior to quilting. This means that the quilting will be right over and through your label, which really is an added level of security because it's more difficult to remove. If you quilt by check, make sure to contact your quilter first. This type of label will need to be inset quite a bit, and you need to make sure that that location where it's going to be is going to be within your quilt. Quilting the label information into the quilt top is another option, and there are no hard and fast rules. The label information would just be incorporated into the quilting of the quilt top. You can quilt it so that it stands out or so that it blends. You could feature it in a block or incorporate it into the negative space. Your quilt, your way. If you're in a hurry, some write their label information right on the quilt back itself. One caveat to all this information is regarding show quilts. If your quilt is for show, read the show rules and guidelines prior to labeling your quilt. This goes for hanging sleeves as well. Quilt shows could have their own set of guidelines and rules about quilt labels, about their size, about what information to include on them, and even their location. The quilt label could be pieced into one of the quilt blocks that's incorporated into the quilt top, or the block could be pieced into the backing, or even adhered with fusible or stitched on before or after quilting. You could include scrap pieces of fabric around or behind your label just in case, or you could include a lock of hair like this quilt. My dog Shiloh was my sewing partner, and well, actually he did everything with me. And when I was sewing, he was always present. And so this quilt is the last quilt that he sewed with me. And so I dedicated this quilt to him and included a lock of his hair. There are no hard and fast rules. Your label, your way. Labels can be simple or fancy, include the information you want, and be placed where you want. Create your label when you're piecing your quilt top. While you have all of your fabric and supplies out, it will be less hassle then, and you will have peace of mind knowing it's completed. A quilt with a label and its story attached will help ensure that your quilt can be treasured for generations. Last, artists sign their work, and so should you.